I got told this very recently by someone who knows what they're talking about, but apparently, here's an interesting fact, you don't actually need a parachute to skydive. Did you know this? Apparently, you only need a parachute to skydive twice. told that by someone, and more of that in a moment. I'll explain why. Our topic today is we're looking at something called real hope. I hope you've been told that already. And what we're doing each night this week is we're looking at the person of Jesus and his teaching and how it relates to our lives today. What we're going to be thinking about is how it is Jesus, in particular, offers a real hope even in the face of death, which is quite a claim we're going to be looking at. In 1973, a guy called Ernest Becker, he wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book called The Denial of Death. And the main thesis of his book is that the fear of death haunts the human person like nothing else does. In fact, Becker argued in his book that the fear of death is one of the chief motivators of all human activity. So he's arguing that much of what everyone does day to day is done to try and overcome the finality of death. Now, I guess we all know death in our society is kept away from our experience, it's kept away from our thoughts. We try not to think about it, try to distract ourselves, keep ourselves busy. We especially try and keep out of our thoughts that nagging reality that death makes everything we do ultimately meaningless if this life is all there is. We don't really like that thought. Woody Allen once famously quipped, "Death is absolutely stupefying in its terror, and it renders anyone's accomplishments meaningless. It makes our lives look as irrelevant as waves breaking over the seashore." I'm sorry if this is a bleak moment, but it's good for us to look at topics that we otherwise deliberately ignore, but which are real. This is an event which none of us puts in our diaries, death, well, probably, hopefully, but it's an appointment we all will keep, and it's important that we think about it before it happens. So what do we do? Given this kind of shadow that death casts, it makes life seem meaningless if we think about it. Well, we've got various options. Lots of people obsess about health. We do everything we can in terms of beauty products. We try and slow down this inevitable journey towards old age and death. I think particularly, and this depends on age groups, but I've seen my contemporaries, they start thinking about leaving some kind of lasting legacy. They're desperate that some part of us might live beyond the grave. But the reality is that each one of us is free falling at 60 seconds per minute towards death. So it really is as though we're skydiving without that parachute. If we can distract ourselves from what is coming, we can pretend that all is well, we can pretend we're free for a little while, but the truth is, each one of us is, in some sense, enslaved by this thing that's coming. And that's why it's really great to have evenings like this, when we get to see that there is hope. The situation we're going to look at, Jesus uniquely can promise the parachute that we need. He can promise a real and concrete and certain hope, even in the face of death. And it's not simply something which is a useful insurance policy, you stick it in the back pocket and it might come in useful one day. But just as, whether we acknowledge it or not, death casts that shadow backwards over every day of our lives, in a similar way, Jesus' promise of eternal life casts light and hope and meaning over every day of our life. So what we're going to do, if you've got one of these grey books, each night we're looking at a section of this. If you turn to page 70 in the books, we're looking at an incident where Jesus demonstrates his authority even over death. John chapter 11. Let me give you a bit of backstory here. One of Jesus' friends is called Lazarus. He was taken ill. His sisters asked him to come and heal him. Jesus had a ministry where he was often healing people, but he didn't make it in time. And actually, by the time Jesus gets to visit the family, which is quite a way away, Lazarus, his friend, had died and had been dead 4 days. And in the immediate section running up to this, page 68, Lazarus has chatted to the 2 sisters and he's tried to help them as they're coping with the grief. But we're going to pick up the story from verse 38, which is that final paragraph on page 68. It says this: Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Now that word, which translated for us, deeply moved, in verse 38, it's actually quite a difficult one to capture in English. If you read different translations of the Bible, they often go for different options, which tells you that it's quite hard to pin it down. It's a word usually used for animals, and it literally means to snort or to bellow with anger. One commentator on the verse says this: then Jesus, again bristling within himself. That's how he translates it. It's like a champion preparing for a conflict. And as Jesus kind of comes up to Lazarus' tomb, the picture we're given here is that he's really psyching himself up for a fight. Let's keep going. Verse 39. Take away the stone, he said, and then over the page. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odour, for he has been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! And then we read this amazing verse, verse 44. The dead man came out. And this really is the stuff of horror movies. You can imagine, can't you, a corpse stumbling out of a tomb. This is what really happened. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. And that word, let him go, that word for unbinding him, is the same one used elsewhere for unbinding someone from the cords of death. It's as if Lazarus' resurrection in these verses is expressed as a fight, a conflict, and it's as though Jesus is having to wrestle with death in order to release this man from its icy clutches. Now, to understand why this incident is such an ordeal for Jesus, we need actually to step back a bit and to ask the question about the origins of death. When somebody is grieving a death, I guess many of us will have had that experience, people often try and comfort us by saying something like, well, death, it's just a natural part of life. I actually tried to trace that quote on Google, and I found out that it's originally, according to Google, by Yoda, in a scene where he says, mourn them, do not. Now, it's a great little line for a movie, it kind of works in the Star Wars world. But if you've ever experienced the death of a loved one, you will know with every fibre of your being that death is not a natural part of life. Death is an unnatural, alien intruder into our world. Human beings were not made for death. We were made to live with our Creator forever. The Bible tells us that death only entered this world as a judgment on human sin. And actually there's something very fitting about this judgment. The decision to rebel against our Creator is a bid really to try and be God. So when we live for ourselves, it's saying that we, rather than God, we will define what is right and wrong, we will live how we see fit. And I guess for us who claim to be God, there's nothing more ungodlike than dying. We become more like the beasts than like God. And since our first parents launched that rebellion against God, we all do the same. We all follow suit. And as you'll have noticed, we all live under the sentence of death. So what this means is that this is not a small thing that is happening here at Lazarus' tomb. God has already declared, if you read the Bible up to this point, that rebellious human beings must die. And so as Jesus breaks Lazarus out of the tomb, Jesus knows that there are going to be some pretty serious implications for him. So let's keep going with the verses. Because next we see that Jesus battling death here is going to be at the cost of his own life. Let's keep going, verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. It's the ruling council. What are we accomplishing? They asked. Here is this man performing many signs. I'll just pause there. Fascinatingly, this is another example. There's no question here that Jesus really did raise Lazarus physically from the tomb. We heard, didn't we? He was in the tomb for 4 days. Dozens of people witnessed his resurrection. And so Jesus' enemies here are in no doubt that he did it. That's not on the table. They're not going to say, oh, it didn't happen. Again and again, they find his miracles undeniable. They just don't like that he did it. Let's keep going, verse 48. They say, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. The Romans, who were the occupying power, had whole legions stationed just a few miles north where this is happening, in Syria. And within living memory, the army had swept through to crush an uprising, and thousands of young Jewish people had been crucified, literally. And this possibility of this happening again is just too dangerous for these leaders to contemplate. And so, verse 49, then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realise that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. So what he's arguing there is that clearly a Jesus who can raise the dead could therefore probably be the focus of some kind of political uprising, and it's far too dangerous. This guy needs to be bumped off before something dreadful happens. But the guy who's writing this account, John, he wants us to understand that there's a much deeper significance to Jesus' death that's coming up. At the time, Caiaphas, we've seen, he was just offering a political opinion of what was going to be expedient. But next we discover that unknown to him, his words were also a prophecy from God. He was speaking better than he knew. He was explaining the real significance of Jesus' death. Let's keep going, verse 51. He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. And not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. It's an amazing moment. Behind the purposes of Jesus' enemies, as always, is the sovereign purpose of the Creator God. They're doing this for one reason, but he's got another reason behind what's about to happen. And in these verses, a connection is being made between Lazarus being raised and Jesus needing to die. Obviously, in the first instance, it's some kind of circumstantial connection. It's because Lazarus is raised that the leaders want to bump him off. But we're also seeing in these verses that there's a logical connection between this guy, Lazarus, being raised from the dead, and Jesus needing to die. Discovering that Jesus, in some sense, is dying for Lazarus, and for the nation, and for the scattered children of God. Verse 52. It's already been hinted at that Jesus' death is going to be in the place of others. And that's a key piece of data as we are reading through this gospel. It helps us unlock this puzzle of why Lazarus' resurrection was expressed as Jesus battling death itself. So it's as if some kind of dialogue was going on between Jesus and death as Jesus was at that graveside. And death was saying, look, if you touch me, Jesus, I will touch you. And so Jesus knew, as he raised Lazarus from the dead, that the only way to spring him out of the ground was to sign his own death warrant. Think of the logic. The wages of sin is death. God had spoken. That is what sin deserves. And so the only way to break Lazarus, to break anyone free from death, is if someone else pays that wage himself. That's what John is trying to get us to understand. And of course, because Jesus is the only human being who never sinned, and we see that again and again in John's Gospel. Jesus says publicly, can anyone here find me guilty of one sin? And imagine if someone today, in a political race, saying that kind of thing. It's just outrageous. But even those who knew Jesus knew that he lived this uncompromised life, this perfect life. Because Jesus never did anything wrong, he's therefore the only one who can pay the debt. And that is what he chose to do by going to the cross. So one of the reasons I believe Jesus was so deeply moved, do you remember in verse 38, why he was bristling within himself as he approached that tomb, is that he understood that he can only battle death, he can only give others life at the cost of his own life. And there was going to be no going back from this. There's a true story about two brothers who grew up in New Orleans, and in that town, dredgers, they used to come up and down that river, dredging up what was on the bottom of the river and dump huge mounds of sand along the riverbanks on both sides. But occasionally the top crust of the sand would get dried out in the sun, and underneath it, as the water drained out, there would form these vast empty caverns deep below. And these two brothers, they loved playing along the banks of the river, along the sand dunes. One day the boys didn't return home at dinner time. And so obviously the family and the neighbours organised a search party right along that riverbank where they used to play. And mercifully they found the younger brother. But only his head and his shoulders were visible above the sand. And actually he had fallen unconscious because of the pressure of sand on his body. So the searchers, when they saw him there, began digging away frantically. And when they had cleared the sand to his waist, wonderfully he regained consciousness. And they were able to ask him, "Where is your brother?" And the child replied, "I'm standing on his shoulders." Because when the crust had collapsed, and as that sand was starting to flood into the pit the boys had fallen into, in that moment the older boy lifted his brother onto his shoulders, and he gave his own life to lift his brother to safety. In this incident, Jesus knew that lifting sinful human beings from the grave to live forever, that's what Lazarus' resurrection here is pointing us forwards towards. Jesus knew that it was going to cost him everything. It's the only way. And yet he still did it. He did it out of love. Now we need to be clear here that what happened in this one-off incident in John 11, what Jesus did here to Lazarus, is actually only really a picture of what Jesus really came to earth to do. So Lazarus was raised from the dead to live a few more years. Actually, we discover in the next chapter, chapter 12, verse 10, that they weren't very easy or straightforward years. As always with Jesus' miracles, his enemies couldn't deny they happened, and so they tried to deal with the situation by threatening Lazarus and trying to bump him off. So poor Lazarus had a difficult end of his life. Now Lazarus' resurrection here is to point us forward. It's a visual aid to point us to something much greater. If you look back a page at verse 25, this is when, this is page 68, when Jesus is talking to Martha, the sister of Lazarus. These are famous verses, verse 25. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? It's a wonderful moment. Jesus is explaining the significance of what he's about to do. He's promising that for those who believe in him, there is resurrection life beyond the grave. Whoever receives this resurrection life, Jesus says, will never die again. On that day when God puts right everything that has gone wrong in this world. And on that day when those who belong to Jesus will enjoy a perfect life with him in a recreated universe. Now, discovering that Jesus battled death and won, and yet that he did it at the cost of his own life, when someone starts to understand these truths, it changes everything. And as we close, I just want to bring out two implications of this for our lives. And actually, to the extent that we understand these truths, it will make two big differences. We will be devoted people to Jesus, and we will be very hopeful people through anything that this world can throw at us. So first, we'll be devoted. What this account tells us is that the star, the champion, the hero in this passage, the Lord Jesus, he's not simply invincibly powerful, summoning a corpse out of the grave. He's also extravagantly, courageously loving. In November 2010, Prince William presented Kate Middleton with an engagement ring which was valued at £250,000. It was a ring that belonged to William's mother, Diana, and it was a very, very generous gift, and it was a reminder of William's great wealth and power and status. But how much more special it is to receive a gift which isn't just one of several options in the vaults, but a gift which costs the lover everything he has. A gift which speaks not simply of the giver's wealth and power, but also of his selfless and extravagant love. So our champion doesn't simply say, I can protect you, I can care for you, even through death. This champion says, I will protect you and care for you, even though it costs me everything I am. There's a story, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's an ancient story about Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire. And he once captured a prince and his family, and the Emperor Cyrus, he asked his prisoner, what will you give me if I release just you? I will give you half of my wealth, was the prince's reply. And what if I release your children? I will give you everything I possess. And what if I release your wife? Your Majesty, I will give myself. Now Cyrus had actually had these kinds of conversations lots of times before. He used to toy with those he had captured and tease them. And he knew that that kind of response, that kind of chivalry was not normal, it wasn't typical. And he was so moved by this man's devotion to his wife that he decided to free the whole family. And on their way home, the prince said to his wife, wasn't Cyrus the most glorious of men? And with a deep look of love for her husband, she said to him, I didn't notice. I couldn't take my eyes off you, the one who was willing to give himself for me. People come to follow the Lord Jesus for all kinds of different reasons. In fact, it might be a good thing to chat about on your table if there's Christians on your table. I was sharing last night, part of the reason for me was discovering that the things that I was pursuing in life were very frail and that they weren't really delivering, they were enslaving, and I found when I heard Jesus' offer of a security in life and a freedom, I just thought, I need that. Other people, they just get intellectually persuaded. This was probably Niv's experience. We were hearing it at lunchtime. He just got cornered into the situation. You could see who Jesus is, and I guess as creator and judge, of course, you'd be mad not to respond to him. I don't think either of those, or whatever reasons people give for turning to Jesus, are bad reasons. There's all kinds of good reasons to turn to him. But I hope that as someone gets to know Jesus better, that wouldn't be the only reason that they follow him. Ultimately, Jesus doesn't simply want us to be persuaded to commit ourselves to him. He wants us to be melted to do so, to be ravished to do so, to, like that prince's wife, to be wooed, to be helpless to do anything else. So we don't simply obey Jesus and follow him because that's how we're supposed to relate to the one who made us. And we know that's probably going to be for the best. As we get to know Jesus, as we understand his devotion to us, of course we delight to obey him. We long to please the one who's loved us so much. And the other, well, as we grasp who Jesus is and this wonderful offer he makes, it's naturally going to mean a devotion in our lives. But secondly, it's also going to mean that we will be a very hopeful people. That guy I mentioned at the beginning, Ernest Becker, he's completely right. The fear of death does haunt the human animal like nothing else does. It does cast a shadow of meaningless over everything we do. And as I mentioned, I think our culture's only strategy at the moment, it seems, is just to desperately keep distracting ourselves from that and trying not to face up to reality. Jesus offers an alternative. He offers us real hope. He provides the parachute that we need. And his promise of life casts light and hope and meaning over every day of our lives. As we close, I'll try and illustrate the difference that this kind of hope makes in our lives by just talking about one person, a woman called Joni Eareckson Tada. She was involved in an accident when she was 17, and since then she's been quadriplegic, so she's been paralysed from the neck down. She's written extensively about how this message I'm explaining tonight, how this hope has transformed her life. She wrote this: I, with shriveled bent fingers, atrophied muscles, gnarled knees, and no feeling from the shoulders down, will one day have a new body, light, bright, and clothed in righteousness, powerful and dazzling. Can you imagine the hope that Jesus' power over death gives someone who is spinal cord injured like me? Now, none of us, I guess, are in her situation. I don't know what particular challenges you're facing in your situation at the moment. Perhaps there is something in your life which does make you think, is there hope? Is there meaning and purpose? I do know that Jesus' power over death changes everything. For those who trust in life, the future is very bright. One writer puts it like this: ordinary life is going to be redeemed. Food and work and chairs by the fire and hugs and dancing and mountains, everything is going to be redeemed and made perfect. And that is what is in store for us. And if you know that this is not the only world, the only body, the only life that you are ever going to have, that you will someday have a real, concrete, perfect life, who cares what people do to you? You're free from ultimate anxieties in this life. You can be brave, you can take risks, you can face the worst thing, even real sufferings in this life, with great joy and with concrete hope. I'm going to leave things there, and it would be great if you, that was the beginning of the conversation, and it would be great if you did raise questions and things like that, and we will deal with those in a bit. Use the text number there, but thank you.